Before we begin, I have a few words about the protocol for the event today. We will begin just in a minute and end at 5:30 Pacific time with the Q&A to begin around 5 o'clock. And all those in the audience, I will ask to keep audio and video off. And as I host, I will wield the power of the mute button if need be. And so when we begin the Q&A, everybody is invited, those of you who have questions, anytime during the presentation to type their questions in the chat box, and I will maintain a log of the questions. And then when we get to the Q&A, I will screen and read out the questions for our speaker until we reach the time. Author of 3 books, including her most recent, The Dawn Watch, Joseph Conrad and a Global World, and a globally renowned authority on the history of the British Empire and the history of modern globalization. She's currently engaged in a wide-ranging study of ancestry and inheritance in human history. Today, her lecture will explore historical approaches to how ancestry affects our opportunities, our rights, and our sense of who we are. How did ancestry come to play such a critical role in defining status, a question that she promises to address in this lecture. Weaving together anthropology, genetics, and history, the lecture will reflect on the human preoccupation with lineage from the origins of Homo sapiens to the DNA tests of today. And the title of Dr. Jasanoff's lecture is Ancestors, Where Do We Come From and Why Do We Care? And at that, I will turn the Zoom floor over to Dr. Jasanoff.
Thank you, Nilesh, for that introduction. Thanks to all of you for joining for joining me and allowing me to join you. Given that this lecture topic is concerned with the issue of ancestry, let me also acknowledge that I'm speaking today from the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Massachusetts people. And I wish I were with you in British Columbia, but here we are. Nilesh mentioned in his kind introduction that my lecture promised to do various things. I'm not entirely sure whether I'll be able to deliver, but let me just say a quick thing about the context in which I'm presenting to you today, which is that for a number of years now, I've been teaching a course here at Harvard on the topic of ancestry. And I am at the moment sort of trying to find my way from the format of developing this topic over the course of 25 lectures over a whole semester into figuring out ways to put it into more sort of scholarly forms and ultimately into a book. And so, we're a relatively small group today, and I hope it will afford the chance for a nice discussion after I speak, because I'm particularly keen actually to hear from you also about sort of how, where I need to be pushing harder, because I know I need to be to make certain connections. And I'm also going to be experimenting with a particular sort of order of presentation, which we'll see if it works. This question, where are you from? It's one of these universal questions. It comes up all the time, and on the face of it, it's a very simple question. On the face of it, too, the answers can be pretty simple. If I were with you right now in BC, I would answer probably that I was from the United States. When I'm traveling within the US and people ask me, I might say I'm from Boston. Earlier in my life, I might have said that I was from Ithaca, which is my hometown in upstate New York. And if I'm at an academic conference or something, then the answer I might give would be Harvard. So, apparently a simple question. Answers, depending on the context, seems pretty straightforward. But in my experience of being asked this question, more often than not, when I give an answer and I see somebody sort of look a little bit confused, I can kind of guess what the follow-up question is going to be, because there is often a bit of hesitation and then the question, no, where are you really from? And when people ask that follow-up, then I know that they want a different kind of answer. They don't want a question, they don't want an answer that's based, in something to do with where I live. They really want an answer that is based on something about how I look. And that, in turn, is a question about where I come from in terms of my ancestral origins. So at that point, I might say, my mother is from India, to which some interlocutors, particularly if they know my last name, well, we'll come to that in a second, they'll say, okay, your mother's from India, but what about your father? And then I'll say, well, my father's American. And they'll say, well, American, I mean, most people in America have, immigrated from somewhere else. So where's your father really from? And if they know the last name, they'll say, that's, what kind of an American name is that? So I'll say my father's Eastern European, but really my father is Ashkenazi Jewish Eastern European. And so I'll elaborate with that. But at this point, they'll say, okay, well, your father's Jewish, so then what about your mother? And I might say my mother's Hindu, my father's Jewish, but neither of my parents is a practicing religious person. I myself was raised completely secularly, and I'm an atheist. And so at this point, we're really very far from any kind of sense that I have of what of some sort of designation of who I really am. And so, this apparently simple question can tumble into a lot more complicated things. So I'm imagining that some of you on this call have had conversations like this, and perhaps have thought a little bit about what is going on here. What is going on is that when somebody asks where you're from, they're potentially asking something about your ancestry. And when they're asking something about your ancestry, they are also potentially asking something about your identity. Now, you don't have to go very far in, I think, the sort of broader North American, Anglophone, Francophone North American world today to see that the question of where we have come from is a matter of quite palpable public and popular interest. And it's also one of political salience. The surge in ethnic nationalisms has coincided with this huge proliferation of the means of studying genealogy and ancestry through, for example, the digitization of archives on sites such as ancestry.com. I looked up today ancestry.ca to see how they present themselves differently in Canada and from the US. And I'm showing you the Francophone version here. And the Anglophone version actually doesn't have any pictures at all. And it has a sort of rolling text that says, my grandparents are or were from Poland, and then it sort of fills in, my grandparents met on a boat called blah, 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 coming from Poland. Anyway, just kind of interesting how they present it to different audiences. So there's an immense sort of surge in digitally available documents. Internet research on genealogy is one of the top search kind of categories in certainly in the United States. And I think that because ancestry and identity sort of bleed into one another in so many ways, it is particularly important, in my opinion, to have sort of sharper edged and more rigorous discussions about what ancestry actually is and what it is not. So I mentioned that I teach a course on this subject here at Harvard, and I ask my students to define in a couple of phrases ancestry versus identity. And I think it's kind of interesting to look at these word clouds and see what the results are. As you can see here, when they're invited to reflect on what identity is, individual and person come out right in the middle. When they reflect on what ancestry is, family and people emerge as more significant terms. So we have a sort of individual versus collective contrast here. And we also have a contrast between something to do with the present, if you will, experience, sense, etc., over on the identity side, but of course history and lineage on the other side. And ancestry is a category that overlaps a good deal with, for example, family, but ancestry connotes this change or connections over time, and that's a very important portion of it. So because ancestry deals with issues of lineage, history, descent, and issues of community and collectivities, to figure out why it has the significance it does today, I think it does require us looking beyond some of the sort of casual, blurry associations between ancestry and identity. Identity, of course, itself is has surged in recent years as a sort of term that people are using. This is a Google engram, with the Google books typing in the terms, obviously very flawed in the sense that it's only searching the Google library and what's digitized and so on and so forth. But anyway, one can see that identity as a concept is something that has really boomed fairly recently, whereas ancestry is something that has been around for a long time as the thing people are interested in. Indeed, the question of where do I come from, where do you come from, where do we come from, has preoccupied societies for millennia. Ancestry itself, I would argue, has an ancestry. Every way that we have of knowing where we come from today is layered over other ways of knowing where we have come from, and the significance that ancestry holds in societies and for communities and individuals today is a product of these layerings over time. So by unpeeling it, I think we get a richer sense of why it plays the social and political and cultural role that it does today. So in the rest of my talk today, that's kind of what I want to do. I want to try to unpeel a little bit of the significance of ancestry in our, broadly American societies today. So one of the most popular ways of dealing with encountering ancestry today comes through these DNA test kits, which were kind of a, most popular gift item for people of certain means and dispositions at the holiday seasons of 2017 and 18, where they seem to have peaked in their commercial appeal. And they've been around for a while. The company 23andMe was founded in 2007. It's on the verge of going public now, and they began marketing these things. And again, sort of peaking around 2018. At this point, more than 26 million people in the US have had genetic ancestry tests done using 23andMe, Ancestry, DNA, and others, with the result, incidentally, that by the time 26 million people have done it, which is approaching 1 in 10 adults in the US, you're getting to a point where genetic information that can identify even people who have not taken it exists in these databases for almost everybody, potentially. In the US. So these are hugely popular. There's a lot of them have been taken. What do they actually do? Why are they popular? What do they do? So, genetics 101, with apologies to those of you for whom this is incredibly familiar. Every DNA molecule has 2 strands, right? So you get one from your mother, one from your father. And these strands are themselves the product of inheritance from their parents. So every chromosome is essentially a sort of a patchwork of bits of genetic material that you have inherited from a whole bunch of your forebears. And because with each with each generation, there's another round of recombination, the length of a segment, of a continuous segment that can be pegged to a particular forebear will be shorter the further back in time that ancestor was from you. So not only can we, sequence a chromosome and figure out something about, possible sources of different bits of genetic material, we can also peg them generationally on the basis of the length of the segment. And so all of this allows people to do this kind of reading back in time on the basis of a living individual's DNA. And it's been a source of enormous empowerment, I want to say, for people in particular who lack documentary evidence of their ancestry going back more than a couple of generations, because suddenly you can unlock this much kind of deeper history. It has been championed by, among others, my colleague here at Harvard, Henry Louis Gates, Jr., who does a whole series of television programs about genealogy and family history, and has been a real champion of the ways in which DNA tests can open up access to the past for African Americans whose paper trail is often completely obscure before 1870, when African Americans were, given, the kind of clout in identity documents and American citizenship and all the rest of it that mean that they have a trail. So this can be really empowering. This can be really revelatory. This can be, quite a source of, why is it a popular Christmas gift? It's a source, of great sort of, entertainment for people to find out things about their past that they didn't previously necessarily know. So all that's great, but how is this really telling us? What is this really telling us about the past? So here is a nice little head-spinning pair of graphics for you. So one of the things about the process of recombination that is important to bear in mind is that because there's mixing up at every generation, there's, as I already mentioned, shorter and shorter segments that make their way down into you. And there's also the possibility that you won't get any segments at all from particular ancestors. So on one side of this rather busy slide, I'm showing you a graphic that gives you genealogical ancestors, powers of 2, right? Mother, father, their mothers and fathers, and all the way out. And you see it's sort of even. You go out by powers of 2, and that's the number of ancestors that you have in a perfect system. But on the other side, you see the genetic mapping. And so when the numbers are crunched and the likelihood of your inheriting genetic material from people in your genealogical past is worked out, it turns out that by the time you get back to just 7 generations ago, you have a very low proportion of genetic material from any given person in your genealogical tree. And in fact, by 7 generations ago, there's a certain percentage of relatives for whom you have actually no genetic material in your DNA, and that number multiplies really fast. So by the time you go, about 10 generations back, or call it 250 years, 300 years, something like that, you only have genetic material from about half of your forebears. So it's an incredibly cool and appealing and interesting technology. It tells us things, but how much is it telling us actually about the deep past? How it really works is that your DNA, when it is sequenced, is held up against reference panels of other people's DNA. And that set of samples from other people is itself pegged to particular geographical locations. You'll end up, if you've done this, and some of you perhaps have, with a composition report that might look something like this. I just pulled a random one that was sort of public on the internet, and maybe, for all I know, fabricated, because just to keep it sort of anonymous and random. But you see here, it'll give you these percentages, which indicate the correlation, essentially, of parts of your genome with reference panel samples of people who are correlated with those regions as well. So what this is really doing is telling you what countries you are most likely to have 6th cousins in. And the way that samples are vetted for inclusion in a reference panel will typically be by asking the person who's giving the sample whether all 4 of their grandparents were born in the same basic region. The assumption being that over the last 2 generations or so, there's been a huge amount of migration. But if you go back the idea goes, about 2 generations, and all of your grandparents are from the same place, then they were probably their forebears were probably there for much longer prior to that. So that's how these correlations are done. The whole thing, again, it's telling us interesting things. It's telling us things, but it is operating on a set of assumptions about how people are linked to place and how people in the present who are linked may have been linked to people in the past. And so what that means, to go back to my point, ancestry has an ancestry. The genetic tests of today are layered over conceptions of, for example, what it is to be British and Irish, or what it is to be French and German, or what it is to be Scandinavian, as I'm reading off of this ancestry report right here, which are geographical and to some extent political constructs, which are, relatively new. And so what is behind all of this is an assumption that certain populations are linked to certain locations, that certain populations have an ancestral link to certain locations. And this in turn takes us to an earlier sort of chapter in the ancestry of ancestry, which I'd like to turn to next. So I find in American society, United States society today, it is quite common for people to swap out the word ancestry for race or ethnicity in colloquial parlance. And there's a kind of long record of doing so. This notion that certain peoples come from certain places has a quite long history. I mean, Herodotus is talking about the different characteristics of different populations in different regions of the world, but it takes on new salience really in the Enlightenment, and with the consolidation of nation states in particular, it comes to have particularly important implications. Enlightenment ideas about this can be, we can see one example in Johann Blumenbach, who proposed 5 different races of humanity coming from different locations. And I'm putting this one up as an example because of the use of Caucasian here as a term. Of course, Caucasian still used pretty widely as a synonym for white, which is a pretty extraordinary thing to do if you look at the sort of backstory of this in the kind of race thinking of the Enlightenment. The chances that people who self-identify as white in the world today have any kind of ancestry that can be traced to the Caucasus in Eurasia is extremely slim, and yet this has stuck around as a bizarre sort of linking of phenotype with a geographical location. At all events, this idea that peoples come from places and are ancestrally sort of descended populations that share an ancestral descent can be traced to particular locations will, of course, take on further ramifications in other ways of thinking in the Enlightenment, in the era of consolidating nationalism, with Romantic nationalism as expressed by Herder, among others. There is this tightening of the association of a common ancestry with the nation. And that finds its most obviously sort of politically charged manifestation in the subsequent elaboration of citizenship law and citizenship rights. So, one sees this distinction emerging, of course, between birthright citizenship and citizenship on the basis of descent. Jus soli, birthright, citizenship, domains marked in this map. These are, of course, of today in dark blue. Jus sanguinis, or citizenship by descent, marked here in gray. And the turquoise ones are sort of something in between, sort of modified birthright citizenship. In most of those cases, fairly new, it has to be said. I mean, if we had a map from 200 years ago, you'd be seeing even more of the Jus sanguinis domains, notably in Western Europe, which has changed, including, of course, in Germany, which only fairly recently shifted over. And so, we can see here, again, this notion that the ancestral origins are what grant you rights of belonging in the nation is absolutely the norm in quote unquote old world societies of Asia, Africa, and Europe. And it is with the advent of course, mass settler colonialism after 1500 in particular, and transatlantically, that new ideas of how to correlate populations to places have to be formed on the back of this mass set of migrations, both forced, of course, and free. So what ends up happening is that in immigrant heavy societies, such as those of the Americas, the question of citizenship is transferred from a matter of typically paternity or parentage to really the border. Because the border becomes the place that, once you cross it and you get in, automatically, obviously, your descendants are going to be citizens. And so the border becomes a critical site for the litigation of inclusion and exclusion. And the border, therefore, becomes a really important site for the litigation of ancestry. How this happens is well documented, of course, through all of the studies that have been done, of course, particularly salient for British Columbia and the west coast of the United States on Chinese exclusion. Chinese exclusion laws were where the beginnings of the modern US immigration regimes begin, and work has shown that the kind of erection of global border controls really comes out in the era, in the process of trying to keep Chinese migrants out. But it has kind of fascinating implications in different legal regimes, and I'll just cite the one sort of most, I think, sort of rich example of this in United States case law in a period when Asian exclusion laws are in effect. And in order to be able to come into the United States and to become a citizen, well, in order to be able to become a citizen, you need to be able to show that you are white. Now, again, race and ancestry are very closely entwined. So how does this actually work out? Well, in the case of Bhagat Singh Thind, who is a Punjabi immigrant in the United States, the question facing the court is whether he counts as white, because under the 14th Amendment, everyone born in the US gets citizenship, but according to the Naturalization Act of 1790, only a, quote, free white person can naturalize as a citizen. So this is tested again by a number of Asians. He comes to the court. He's a World War I veteran. And what does he argue? He says, as a North Indian, I am an Aryan. And playing in, of course, to one of these ethnic, ancestry myths linking a particular place to particular appearance of population to a particular place. He says, I am an Aryan, which means I'm a Caucasian, which means that I count as white. The court comes back to him and says, not quite, because simply being able to say that you're descended from a Caucasian, mind you, he had said he was descended from an Aryan, so we're already seeing some pretty amazing slippages here, is not enough to show that you're actually white, because we're now going to say, despite having said earlier that Caucasian equals white, we're now going to say that it doesn't, and that actually to look at you, well, well, guess what? You don't, to us, look like you're white, and so therefore we're not gonna allow this to happen. So, I'm just citing one of a gazillion cases that really test the frontiers of ancestry and race as they become pertinent in the issue of citizenship law, which I will contend is one of the fundamental reasons why ancestry matters down to the present day, is because it is imbricated in these very palpable legal ways of determining who gets to belong and who gets what rights. The notion that the right ancestry could deliver political rights in turn was layered over a sort of broader set of ways in which the right ancestry came to spell belonging in the settler colonial societies of the Americas. A particularly distinctive expression of this can be found in the 1850s in the United States, in the emergence of the Know Nothing Party, and the whole concept of nativism. We can just look at that term. The concept of nativism is quite fascinatingly brought out by this particular political party, which is established as an anti-immigrant party in the 1850s. It is anti-immigrant, it's anti-Catholic. They make a point of calling themselves Native Americans, by which they mean Americans who are not immigrants, by which they mean Americans who are Anglo-Saxon as opposed to Celtic, who are Protestant as opposed to Catholic. But they're also playing here on this notion of the native as the native indigenous American, and hence the imagery that you see on the right-hand side of this slide, organizing themselves into wigwams and so forth. So, again, lots of muddled stuff here, but again, this concept of nativism coming to spell actually a particular strand of immigrant origins, not indigenous at all, but using it to one-up other people on the basis of an idea of ancestral descent. And you can essentially trace the rise of immigration in the United States by looking at the emergence of so-called lineage societies as they are formed in the later 19th century. So, these organizations, which are sometimes the target of a type of mockery today, emerge in the period of mass immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. And of course, they also emerge in the aftermath of the Civil War, when Jim Crow laws are taking shape. And this is not coincidental at all. And here are just a few of them, all getting kind of, coalescing in the later 19th century. Of course, I'll add, because of course, I want to mention the Canadian example here. The United Empire Loyalists Association is formed in 1914. This is a time, of course, when there's a desire to try to rally around Greater Britain for the purposes of World War I. But this too is a lineage organization tracing descent from members of the Loyalist diaspora, obviously with very strong connections to Anglo-Canadian society, particularly in the eastern provinces of Canada, and one can also see heritage and lineage societies of rather remarkable forms in Brazil. This is the Fraternity of American Descendants, which are the descendants of Confederate migrants who moved to Brazil in the 1860s and 70s and continue to this day to put on these annual festivals of Confederate belonging. So what is going on here? Well, it is still popular among certain people in certain communities to claim descent from particular originary events and particular originary people. to claim descent from founding fathers, a terminology that is in no way, is also in no way coincidental to the obsession with genealogy that takes shape in North America, in the United States in particular. And all of this, in turn, is another layer over something else. And that is that while ancestry connoted political rights and a sense of sort of ownership within a national community, it also, of course, connoted more generally issues of status. So how does that work? Well, what happens when descent is tied to social status, when ancestry is tied to social status? One of the things you want to do is you want to try to keep track of it. And you want to keep track of it, particularly when you're proud of it, particularly when you think you have someone back there in your lineage who's important. And you want to keep track of it increasingly in the early modern and even the medieval era, because you want to be able to figure out who gets to inherit what, who gets to marry whom, and how to leverage your family's wealth, or for that matter, overcome its lack thereof, in your present life. And so this ties in with a much kind of larger set of practices to do with the organization of genealogy and kinship, which can be found in all societies around the world. Every society has a kinship system subject to massive amounts of anthropological literature. I'd be happy to talk about that and its relevance here a little bit more in the Q&A. But the key point that I want to make is that once you have kinship systems, or when you have kinship systems, you also typically have some way of keeping track of them. The ways you may have of keeping track of them can vary widely. They can include oral genealogies, practices of, for example, reciting the names of ancestors along a particular line, typically a male line in a number of societies, but not always. Learning these names is one way of keeping genealogies. Written genealogies, of course, are another hugely significant form. It indeed takes place in one of the most foundational texts of the modern, the modern West and beyond, in the Bible itself, which is essentially a genealogy. The Bible, it's not all a genealogy, but the book of Genesis has these unbelievable lists of begats and begottens and whatever. Why? Because it is trying to establish various claims about status, and communities of faith and communities of descent within the Jewish and the Christian religions. And I'm showing you here genealogies that exists in the book of Genesis. These genealogies, of course, were used, as some of you may know, they were used in the early modern period, among others, by people who wished to calculate the age of the earth. And so they could count back, using the genealogies to figure out, the date of the creation. And they were also used, of course, to establish particular claims of status for Jesus. There are lineages in a couple of the Gospels. This is one of them. Abraham is the patriarch of the Jews, of the Muslims, and the ancestor of Jesus. And that lineage is, of course, traced, as I say, in the Gospels. I just heard a story on the radio today about the Pope's visit impending to Iraq, where he's planning to hold a mass at the site of the birthplace of Abraham, a site, of course, of significance to multiple faiths. This is really interesting as an illustration, I think, of the ways in which genealogies were used to establish status in the period of the coalescing of the biblical texts, because, of course, Jesus is the Son of God. But he is here given an earthly genealogy in the form of the genealogy of Joseph, who is the figure at the end of this. And Joseph is given this sort of, spiritually significant genealogy and high status genealogy going back to Abraham. Another of the Gospels traces it back to Adam. So it's from the Bible that another form of genealogical record will take shape that has particular significance in the modern world. So there's oral genealogies, there's written genealogies. Each of these has sort of pros and cons in terms of who gets captured in them, how does the information get stored, how does it get passed on, who has access to that kind of knowledge. There's another form of genealogy, which is, of course, again, I think the most widespread today, and that is, of course, the family tree, a visual genealogy. A written genealogy of the kind that you find in the Bible is really good for offering a lineage, a chronicle, a list. What can a visual genealogy do that a written genealogy cannot? Well, the first visualizations that are of genealogy that are taking the tree form, that are attested in Europe, certainly. I don't know of others outside Europe, though if you do, please let me know. Illustrate the lineage of Jesus, taking as their source the biblical verse about a branch coming from Jesse. And so they're called the trees of Jesse, and you see them cropping up in the 12th century in a couple of different forms here. And these indicate one thing that visualizations can do that lists cannot, and that is that they can be read in two directions. You see on the one side Jesse and figures emerging from Jesse. You see on the other side Jesus at the top. I mean, he's at the top on the other side as well, but sort of on high, and the connections kind of working out in relation to him. Sort of reading down as opposed to reading up. And this is something that will be played with across all kinds of other visualizations of genealogy that will quickly start to spread in medieval Europe. Because one of the things, as I said, this can do is it can be read up and it can be read down. It can also be read out. And what the visualization of the genealogy as a tree allows for is the creation of a community of lineage, as well as just that one particular line. Imagine, for example, reciting an oral genealogy in which you're capturing all of the lateral branches as well, right? It's just a different way of doing it. Equally, of course, one could say, imagine, trying to do a visualization that includes all the lateral branches and goes way back. That might be a little harder to do. So this is able to create a community as well as a sort of two-directional kind of reading. And it ends up really, as I say, going viral. I mean, I would say the family tree is kind of one of the world's most successful infographics. It is exported quickly to secular contexts. It is exported first to royals, but then beyond, also to non-royal and non-aristocratic families. It is exported across religious and cultural and imperial borders. And you can find the concept of the genealogical tree cropping up at this point in societies all over the world. I also want to point out that the tree is an infographic that has a sort of wider life in the world of thinking about ancestry. It can connote particular people's ancestry, either the descendants of a particular individual or the forebears of a particular individual. And it also ends up, of course, being a way of thinking about concepts and the way they're linked to each other. And I think, again, it's zero coincidence that with the ascent of eugenics, in the early 20th century, the eugenics conferences that are held in the 20s and 30s take the tree as their symbol for indicating what eugenics is about as well. So here's the family tree of eugenics, where you see it being fed by all of these different sources of intellectual input. Like a tree, eugenics draws its materials from many sources and organizes them into an harmonious entity. Eugenic thinking was behind the mass production of family trees by individuals who sort of bought into different eugenic projects. And its founder, one of its key founders, Francis Galton, was himself drawn to the concept of eugenics through his own genealogy because he was descendant of the Galtons and the Wedgwoods and the Darwins of the British Industrial Revolution, and counted as his cousin, Charles Darwin. I say all this because I want to sort of loop us now back around to what is at once, I think, an originary point for the obsession with ancestry in human societies and the reasons why it matters, and is also one that has recently gotten a sort of new lease on life today. So I've tried to take us back from the DNA tests that are incredibly popular today to the reasons why the location of populations to the correlation of populations to locations came to signify, and the ways in which that was attached to political rights and ideas of nativism and nationalism and belonging, how that was linked to the practice of genealogies, and which became, as I say, sort of hugely popular, secularized, democratized in the 18th, 19th centuries from what had previously been more religiously and aristocratic sort of forms. And prior to all of that, there is the question of who is at the top of the family tree, or at the root, as the case may be. Somewhere in here, what is also happening is a quest for an origin, for a founding figure, for a point from which it all comes. Every one of us has this, times 2 powers of 2 sort of pyramid of genealogical ancestors. But somewhere back there, there's a 1 or a 2 or a 10 or something like that from which everyone comes. And so this triangle or this pyramid is really something of a diamond. And ultimately, we come back to that originary source. So where do we come from? Well, again, basically every society that I know of, that I've read about, that anthropologists have studied, has some kind of origin story, and often their own, these origin stories will themselves capture some set of accounts of how people in the present are linked to that point of origin. Origin stories include, the whole vast range of things, creation stories of all kinds. But the origin story, we also today, we have an origin story as well about where we come from. And the we in that particular sentence is the human species, Homo sapiens. The story of where Homo sapiens comes from was radically transformed in the middle of the 19th century with the work of Darwin, and also with the discovery and identification of certain kinds of human remains. The remains of Homo neanderthalis were found in the Neander Valley in Germany in the 1850s. And subsequent researches in human remains have been an incredibly important source of enriching the family tree, so to speak, of the human species. This story of where Homo sapiens comes from has been, as I already have kind of, trailed a few times, transformed by new research using genetics. Whereas in earlier generations, people working with human remains would, study skull size and spine shape and all these kinds of things. It has relatively recently become possible to extract DNA samples of high enough quality to be sequenceable. And with that has come this kind of avalanche of evidence, genetic evidence, of the prehistoric genetic makeup of prehistoric individuals. This is all sort of loosely covered by the term ancient DNA, although truly ancient here is used to connote really any sort of human remains that are used from 150 years ago or so, all the way back to 200,000 years ago. And work in this area, which is being done, a lot of it right here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, by my colleague David Reich, has, extracting these DNA samples from individuals who lived, as I say, anywhere from 200 to 200,000, 300,000 years ago, has been able to circumvent some of the problems that are intrinsic in those DNA tests, the direct-to-consumer DNA tests that I began my talk by describing. Those tests are matching your sample with that of other living or recently living individuals in the database, whose grandparents may have lived in the same location as them. Well, given all of this loss that we have of generations, those people whose grandparents lived in the same place as they did, are not, you're not necessarily getting a ton of resolution. If, however, you are able to sequence the remains of an individual who lived in a location 6,000 years ago, because you found that skeleton, you've pulled it out of a bog or something like that, that gives you a very different kind of insight into the correlation of peoples with place. The research in ancient DNA has therefore transformed the population, what we know about the origins of Homo sapiens and human population history much more generally. I could show you a gazillion graphics here as well that would give different levels of resolution in terms of time periods of different human population movements, but I want to give here a rather deep history picture. This is the latest map of human population movement, human population history, based on samples using ancient DNA. Some of the things that it highlights include, we've continued to multiply out the number of other hominins that were living in the world alongside Homo sapiens, the Denisovans being a great example, where a full remains have not been come by, but the DNA sequencing has allowed the identification of this particular hominin species. This research has also, of course, identified mixing between Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalis, and the Denisovans, and so on. This research has shown that, contrary to the single out of Africa thesis that I at least learned when I was in school of human population history, in fact, there were multiple movements out of Africa and back into Africa, which is partly what accounts for the very recent discovery that there's some Neanderthal genetic material to be found in individuals of African descent today, as well as those of European and Asian descent. And all in all, what this has done is create a picture of human population history that shows that, for all that there is somewhere in there the ability to link populations to place, that story is a story of such constant mixing and movement that any notion that there are these sort of Anglo-Saxons or Aryans has to be kind of thrown out, because we know that before that there were other mixings, and before that there were other mixings in turn. I end with this sort of loop from the genetics of the present that are telling us about DNA kits, super interesting, for consumers today, and this deep history picture that we have of human origins, because in a way they're both, I think, today striving at a particular message that is popular among advocates of the genetic approaches to ancestry. And it goes something like this. It says, okay, look, in the past, yeah, there were claims about why ancestry mattered and to whom that were basically exclusionary, that kept people out, that were used to erect different kinds of laws, that were used, among others, to identify certain populations as less desirable than others, to mark them out and to single them out for penalties. But now we know that actually everybody is all mixed up. Now we know that everyone's mixed. We can give these DNA tests to people. They discover that they're much more mixed than they thought. And really, we're going to end up in a much happier situation going forward. So ancestry matters in human societies for all kinds of reasons, but it's going to matter going forward because it's going to show us that actually we all are much more mixed and much more similar to each other than we are different. This is a wonderful set of things to believe. It makes me feel happy when I hear it, but I'm not entirely sure that I can, because I think that when we look at the history of ancestry, what we see is that it is time and again used as a method of excluding and creating divisions as much as it is ever used to include people. Notions of origins divide communities to say, you know, we are from this origin, you are from that origin, we get different priorities over you. And I am actually, therefore, less sanguine, I have to say, about the potential of some of these sorts of devices, particularly the advent of DNA, because, you know, even something as seemingly benign as the family tree could be turned to murderous effect in genocidal regimes. The Nazi regime, in order to enforce compliance with the Nuremberg laws, ended up making it the case that almost all Germans who needed to, you know, comply with the laws to get jobs and all the rest of it had to create family trees and so-called ancestry passports. And I doubt that any of the kids who do family trees in school today, or even the millions of subscribers to Ancestry.com, or even the 26+ million people who have spit into tubes in the United States and sent it off for sequencing, really think about these kinds of consequences. But I think that, again, this is why it is so much, so important now to excavate the ancestry of ancestry, to get these maybe less sort of cheerful visions of why people care about who they are, so that there might be a better chance in future that the ancestry that we do all share will overcome the ancestry that different groups have often used to claim privileges over others. All right, I will end there. Thank you for bearing with me for a whole nearly hour of speaking, and I'm very, very keen to hear your reactions to this extremely synoptic and synthetic talk.
Thank you so much, Maya, for that wonderful talk. I have a whole range of thoughts and questions, and I think as people are gathering their own thoughts on this, I think I'll start. As I don't see any questions as yet in the chat. I would say on a number of fronts, I feel that this work offers a synthetic and a globally historically situated understanding of the history of ancestry. The link of people and place, as you have presented it, is an enduring, let's say, instinct that shows how muddled popular and scientific knowledge possibly always has been, but definitely in the context of ancestry. And there are a few moments that I was really eager to hear a bit more about, and I'll just I'll mention two of them now, and in the meantime I'll ask others to come in. I hope everybody can hear me. One is about the democratization of the idea of ancestry, which you mentioned in the middle of your talk. And I'm wondering if there are moments in the history of science let's say in the history of DNA collection, the history of ancestry as a part of the history of capitalism, that there have been resistances to the very connection between people and place within the science that has been sold. So you have presented this from the perspective of what is being sold. Could you speak a bit about the engagements, the resistances, or the other angles upon which this has been seen?
Sure. So, so with respect to the collection of DNA, as I hear your question, it's about the collection of DNA samples and how people were thinking about that in relation to place. So there's a huge literature on this by scholars of science and technology studies, among others. And, you know, there, of course, the collection of DNA samples has been going on for longer than ancestry testing has been available. And one of the things that's happened is that samples that are collected for one purpose, you know, may end up getting used for other purposes, and there are issues of permission and consent that come up in relation to that. So there was a big project that National Geographic funded in the first decade of this century. I never know what we're supposed to call it, the aughts, I guess, right? So in the aughts, National Geographic had this project called the Genographic Project. And the chief scientist was a geneticist called Spencer Wells. And the idea there was that they were going to go and get in touch with all of the sort of unmixed populations of the world, and travel around, you know, to all of these communities, you know, before they could be sort of lost and diluted, and get them to, you know, give blood, or it was typically given blood, not spitting into tubes, and then use that to create these reference sets of sort of traditional populations in different places. National Geographic, of course, is well known for its exoticization of non-white and non-Western peoples. And this is, you know, if you watch, it's actually quite fascinating to see how even just in the last 10, 15 years, the discourse on these things has changed. If you watch some of Spencer Wells's documentaries, which he made about this on YouTube, they seem incredibly dated, because he's going off and he's, you know, getting these, yeah, sort of untouched natives to give DNA. So one area to consider is, you know, what are the relationships, again, around consent, around, you know, who's agreeing to give what for what purposes. But another one is to think about how the scientists themselves are maybe thinking about, are essentializing these populations, right? Another area that has come up is that, so if you talk to population geneticists about it, and perhaps there are, I don't know if there are any on this call or people who may be able to add to this picture, but when I have talked to population geneticists, they will say, you know, mistakes were made in the past in the way that geneticists worked with indigenous peoples. Kim Tallbear is a very important scholar on this kind of thing, and has exposed all kinds of problems in the way that scientists work. They'll say, okay, we understand that, we're not going to do that, we're going to be much more kind of clear about consent and all the rest of it. But it really is a bummer that those populations don't agree to participate in our studies, because we really need them in order to be able to give a bigger, better picture of what's going on. So I recently actually had a conversation with a population geneticist about this, who made a very compelling case. He said, you know, when we want to try to get health information about different populations and genetic risks of disease and so on for different populations, we are really hampered because the only reference sets that we have are from, you know, for example, the people who could afford to buy the DNA test and decided to spin in and share their information. So they're very interested in trying to get more and more and more of this and try to break down the barriers. But I think that there may be a slightly Pollyanna-ish view that really all it takes is we need to talk to them wisely about it. I think that this issue of the essentializing is one that hasn't yet necessarily been quite adequately addressed. And so I will stop there because I'm obviously kind of rambling about this. But suffice to say, there is a very interesting opportunity for richer conversations across disciplines here. And this is something that touches also on where the real money is ultimately going to be, which is in the medical applications of this, this material.
Thank you so much for that. I invite others to come into the conversation. I haven't noted any other questions yet. I think my connection is a bit unstable. But I was wondering if you could also speak a bit to the democratization part as well. Not only in terms of the collection of data, but in terms of whether the categories that are used, as you showed in the beginning, have been at all engaged with, either by those scientists who might be proposing different categories or ways of thinking about ancestry, or others outside of formal scientists as well.
I'm not quite sure I'm following the question, and I can't quite tell if this is the connection problem that's happening here. Is the question, are scientists proposing other categories?
Yes, I'll turn it to Andrew in a second for his question. But
sorry about that.
But that
the
was
connection is
that was
not very good, so it's a little.
That was the question of whether or not there are any new categories or ways of thinking that perhaps scientists from the inside who have access to this sort of data compared to those who don't and who are following popular popular sources of knowledge, whether there are changes from within the scientific communities about the kinds of categories that are used and the ways of understanding ancestry.
I'm not aware of it. I mean, I think that what I'm seeing is a lot of this defaulting to region, geographical region. I think that there's an awareness that using certain terms for different kinds of peoples can be controversial. I'll give you a very clear example is in relation to Indian, that is South Asian Indian population history, where they sort of came, Aryan is a very charged word. And so the terms instead of using Aryan and Dravidian, the terms ancestral North Indian and ancestral South Indian were used instead. So what I tend to see scientists doing is defaulting to geographical regions and then potentially putting sort of timestamps on things, ancestral or pre or post plus a geographical region. I think that's mostly how I'm seeing this being thought of.
Great, thank you. I will now ask Andrew to ask his question. Andrew Buck.
You need to unmute. That wonderful phrase of the Zoom era that none of us will ever forget.
Indeed. Okay, finally, here I am with a voice. Thanks very much for the talk. My question. Okay, I've got to confess that when it comes to issues like ancestry, I get really, the whole concept of ancestry has always made me feel really creepy. Because I always associate it with concepts of racism and eugenics, always. And what I was wondering, I mean, you took us through in great detail all the sort of ways of understanding it, which was really fascinating. I was wondering how much of your research is devoted to trying to get a handle on why people are attracted to it. Like how it, where this ongoing fascination with ancestry comes from, because from where I'm sitting, I see it as an ongoing fascination with something deeply, deeply problematic that I always associate, as I said before, with concepts like racism and fake science like eugenics. And I'd be interested to know, as
Yeah,
you're doing your research.
totally. I mean, I find it creepy too. I think that but I think that my ultimate point, I mean, it may be, it seems so elementary to say it, but I think ultimately people care about it because it is a fundamental way of organizing societies in terms of who's in and who's out, who gets to marry whom, who gets to reproduce with whom, and who gets to inherit what. I mean, that's ultimately, it is a, I don't I don't want to fall into some kind of structuralist, explanations here, but I mean, there is something about that. Like if you look, across human societies, you see that it is mobilized in those ways, all over. And so my argument would be that, modern race thinking is modern. It is also a way of organizing who gets to marry whom and who gets to reproduce with whom and who gets to inherit what. It's the latest version that we have of doing that, but doing that is something that has, nigh universal purchase around the world. That's what I would say. I'm noticing that somebody, I haven't read it all yet, but something about Morgan here is really interesting. The other thing I want to say about that, and this is something I'm actually puzzling over. So I think that this is my point about layering. I think that the racism and the eugenics are a layer over versions of inclusion and exclusion that ancestry was doing in other periods of history as well. So what I think is interesting, so there are two things. One, I'm increasingly interested in what the different instruments of recording ancestry do, right? So in the 20th century, we gave the power to define ancestry to the life scientists. And that had some really important implications. Earlier, before that, we gave the power of defining ancestry to the state. Before that, the power of defining ancestry, I mean, all of these continue, obviously. I don't mean to say, that one ends because the other starts. Religious institutions, who keeps birth and death records, who keeps marriage records, that might have been with religious institutions. So I'm interested in thinking about that as something that changes. And I'm also interested in thinking about, I don't know if I don't think I would go so far as to say there's sort of epistemic shifts or something, but I'm interested in the fact that a lot of the ways that at the moment, sort of Western globalized elite types talk about ancestry and its importance and the way it's worked into law really was formed in the late 19th century. And that's where the creepiness is. I mean, I think that what's happened now is that a lot of things have been sort of normalized. People don't even think about their correlations with with this older history, hence the use of the word Caucasian. I find it astonishing that people still use this completely, without even doing a double take, And all of this stuff was formed in a particular era when the life sciences approach was on the ascent, when a particular way of correlating people to place was really getting sort of concretized in ways of thinking about race that we're still in. And I find that fascinating and interesting. But to the why, like I say, I think why, because people, I mean, the airy-fairy thing would be people want to know where they belong. I tend to be a little more materialistic. I'd say people want to know what they get and who they get to be with and where they get to go and who they get to mix with.
Thanks very much.
All right.
Great, thank you so much for that. There are several questions coming in, so I'm going to do this in order. And the first question from Andrew Wender. It is an unfortunate irony that Joe Biden yesterday ridiculed Neanderthals in a manner that wades into the, quote, culture wars of contemporary politics. With this in mind, could you please reflect on the implications of your project for contending forms of identity politics as invoked from both the left and the right ends of the ideological spectrum?
Yeah, so I mean, the Neanderthal thing was pretty interesting because one of the things that I've noticed is, there are all of these attempts to try to identify what it is that makes humans human. And, this is the stuff of things like Sapiens, the bestseller, Jared Diamond gets into things of this sort. And the truth of the matter is that, humans were, I think, in general, less special than people like to think they were, and mixed with Neanderthals. And when I was in high school biology, the idea was, species are defined by if individuals from two different populations, if the offspring produced by them is infertile, then it means they're different species. But of course, we see that that's not the case with Neanderthals. So in terms of the culture wars, I mean, I think my basic position on this would be that we have gotten, I think, to a dangerous point at which identity has become a form of authority. And I call that dangerous because while I think it is a form of authority about certain kinds of things, I'm not sure that it's a form of authority about everything. And I think that once you say that identity is the basis for authority, and you put that together with genetic tests that are giving people readouts of their biological identity, I find that extremely worrying. I can go on at length about the ways in which claims are being made by white nationalists, white supremacists about their, genetic origins and all the rest of it. There have been studies done on the way that they react when they take DNA tests that discover that, that surface results that they're not terribly happy with. And the short answer is that they find ways of explaining it away. There's other interesting claims that are made by other populations. One thing that I found my students have actually enlightened me about are the ways in which this is sort of resonating within the Black community and on the Harvard campus, that there are distinctions that are sort of emerging in different ways about people who come from Africa recently, as opposed to people who are descended from slaves in the United States, and various sorts of distinctions that are opening up. And I think that maybe I'm in a pessimistic mood right now, but I think that at the moment, my sense is that ancestry has as much the power to divide as to unite. And that people, I didn't get into this in the talk, but people will always find ways to explain away the ancestors that they don't want to have. And this was a kind of maybe missing link in my talk, that anthropologists will say ancestors aren't born, I'm paraphrasing, they're not born, they're made. That in traditions that involve ancestor veneration, you perform various rites in order to make a dead person into an ancestor. And an ancestor in this sense means a person in the past who has some effect on the world of the living. And I think that, that genetic chart that I showed is for me, like our biological version of that. It's saying, there are certain individuals who have contributed to my DNA. There are many other individuals who are in my genealogical background who have not contributed to my DNA. And so I'm sort of inventing the ancestors genetically as I do it. So anyway, sorry, that was again a rambling answer. But just to say that, yes, it resonates in all kinds of ways, generally in support, as I see it, of exclusionary claims more often than inclusionary ones.
Great. Thank you for that. I have several questions. I want to make sure we get to all of them. Questions from Malia, from Peter Cook, from Dar Rudnicki, and Rachel Hope Cleaves. I'll start with Malia Belibos, and her question is, to many, Jewish is an ethnicity. How does this play out in Ancestry.com reports? Does Israel appear on Ashkenazi Jews reports as well as Eastern European reports? Are there implications for this vis-a-vis Israeli citizenship?
So no, yes. So Ashkenazi Jewish is a category on the ancestry tests. Israeli is not. Sephardic Jewish is also a category on the tests. There's a good genetic basis for it in terms of looking back over 10 generations, which is endogamy. I mean, basically all of these things are records of endogamy, right? So, you know, people who have Ashkenazi Jewish descent do carry distinctive genetic markers. It's pretty easy to pick those out. And it's pretty, you know, it's a robust genetic category, just as it is a pretty robust social category. These are not, you know, these are obviously quite profoundly linked. It does, however, have implications for Israeli citizenship law because of birthright. You know, the Jewish ancestry gives you citizenship in Israel. There's already been tension around Israeli law, which at the moment allows non-halakhically Jewish people to become citizens. Myself, for example, would be included. My father is Jewish, so I don't count religiously, but I do count for Israeli citizenship law. And at the moment, a genetic test would confirm that. So there's no contradiction there. But there was a case of concerns about Russian immigrants, or typically Russians, maybe Eastern Europeans more generally, into Israel, who are coming claiming that they're Jewish and getting citizenship and immigrating into Israel. And at the moment, with some pushback against that, there was a possibility kind of aired, it never got anywhere, but you know, that maybe genetic tests could be used to show whether or not these people actually were Jewish. And the arena in which this was, and it's, I have to say, it's been thrown out. I mean, this is not happening in Israel, but it is certainly something that you could imagine might be done, because you can do this correlation. And then, of course, I mean, I could wade into all of the exclusions of Palestinians as opposed to Jewish Israelis, but I mean, at the moment, at least, the genetic information is going to correlate a lot of the discriminatory laws that are there, as far as I know. There's the other whole question about where did the Jews come from. That's Benny Morris and all of that. I think there's Shlomo Sand and all of that. And I think there are things to be said about that, but I'll leave that for another day.
Great, thank you. We have a few more. I want to make sure we have enough time, so I'm going to
faster. Yeah.
It's wonderful to have this this discussion, but I'm going to read out two questions at once, and one of them relates to what you just said, so I think it'll work. And then I think the last question will go to Dar Rudnicki, whose hand is up. So I will read the two questions that were posted. First, by Peter Cook, who writes, "It is interesting that the rise of those lineage societies in the late 19th century coincided with an anthropological understanding of kinship, as you mentioned earlier, in the wake of Morgan's systems of consanguinity. Did such insights, which might tend to relativize notions of kinship as culturally constructed, create space for folks to push back against nativism, or did the nativists themselves find a use for Morgan?" So that's one. Another question posted in the chat by Rachel Hope Cleaves. "I'm interested in what you've discovered about the history of resistances to ancestry, which I alluded to in my question, and that was evident in Andrew Wender's question. As Rachel writes, there was a lot of antipathy to, quote, ancestry amongst my," meaning Rachel's, "immigrant grandparent, great-grandparents, who were chased out of the countries where they were born by anti-Semitism and pogroms. Is that anti-ancestry sentiment widespread among people who have left countries of origin under racist or anti-religionist duress?"
These are great. So I actually don't know off the top of my head about nativists and Morgan, but what I am immediately reminded of is that Morgan's own interest in ancestry and our kinship came from living in upstate New York among the Iroquois, the traditional lands, on the traditional lands of the Iroquois Confederacy, and he was very close to the Seneca and had a Seneca informant, and he belonged to a fraternal society in upstate New York, which also kind of adopted these, I forgot what they call themselves now, but it was maybe the Society of the Seneca, something like that. And they also adopted these indigenous Native American ideas about rights. And this is also, there's also the question about the vanishing Indian here. I have to think a little bit more about that. You know, Fenimore Cooper, there's something going on there that I think is very interesting about why Morgan got interested in kinship and how that has to do with thinking about the disappearance of Native peoples as they liked to conceive of it in those days. I'll just add that the idea of kinship as culturally constructed is, of course, I'd say that it's a little limited. I mean, that is until you know, the 70s and David Schneider. I mean, you know, there's still ideas that there are certain correct ways to create kinship. And so my hunch would be that the view would be that, well, those people do it that way, but that's a much less sort of meaningful and robust and appropriate way of doing it than the way that we do it. So that's my answer to that. And in terms of the antipathy to ancestry, absolutely. I mean, you know, this is certainly not universal. I was just speaking yesterday, actually, to Chinese American genealogist who was talking about how, you know, some people in her family, you know, she could trace her genealogy back 2,000 years. She spent, you know, decades doing this, but she's now done that. But she has other relatives who, you know, just don't care at all. And her explanation was, you know, if you're facing the future, like there's a lot of people who don't want to think about the past and they want to look to the future, and therefore they want to get away from the past. That's a very important component to this that I feel I need to kind of integrate better. I would not say, however, that I've detected any particular one-to-one correspondence of people of certain backgrounds with the antipathy. I would rather say that I think it may correlate more to cultural moments. So, you know, the melting pot era was one in which certain ideas of assimilation were at the forefront, whereas, you know, we're now in a moment when it's very much sort of seen as desired to recover certain ancestries. Obviously, too, the notion that you're, you know, now the idea that it's quote unquote exciting and interesting for self-identified whites to discover non-white ancestors is baffling. I mean, it's astonishing if you compare it to what would have happened 100 years ago, right? So I tend to think of this more in terms of temporalities than in terms of particular profiles or populations.
Great. I think we have time for one last question, and I will invite Darmir Rudnicki to enter and ask his question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the talk. I really appreciated it. While I was listening to it, I couldn't help but think about a book that I used to teach, and the students were always perplexed by it, but I think it's actually more relevant now than ever. They were perplexed by why I was teaching it, and that book was Imagined Communities by Ben Anderson. And I thought, you know, he has this very interesting argument about the formation of nationalism and national identity. And one of the things I thought was interesting about your talk was the way in which this ancestry, obsession with ancestry, and particularly the genetic obsession, seems to reproduce national identity. And I guess the question is, you know, would these contemporary technologies, Ancestry.com and so forth, I mean, do those kind of bear out Anderson's thesis in terms of the ways in which national communities or national identities are formed? You know, if you read his book, of course, you know, print capitalism is the key technological intervention, but he also draws attention to other technologies such as the census, the map, and the museum in the chapter that got added in the second edition of the book. So I wonder, I mean, does genetic ancestry, DNA, Ancestry.com, does it work the same way? as these earlier technologies of national identification, or do you think there's something different about the way in which this kind of genetic identification works in terms of producing imagined communities?
That's a great point. I think it is creating imagined communities. The imagined communities that it's creating are not coterminous with nation states. Sometimes they might overlap, and you see, I mean, just the popular culture around this is stunning. I mean, just earlier today, because I was curious how this is playing out in Canada, so I looked some stuff up, and there was some feature somewhere of 6 Canadians take DNA tests and here's what they find. And so it showed the picture of the guy, and it says something about what he thinks, where he thinks he's from, and then it gives you the readout, and then it shows you he's pulling his jacket like that, and there's a Union Jack flag underneath it, right? Because it turns out he's mostly British. So there's again the layering. I think that again the language of the DNA tests is one about geographical region, not about nation state, but these are in everyday life. These are overlaid so much that it absolutely has that potential. However, broadly speaking, I actually see this as running counter to some of the technologies Anderson was talking about, which were basically meant to create, more secular and ultimately democratic nations. I think this stuff is actually really going deep into that much more, sort of the other strand of 19th century thought about imagined communities.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maya. I think we're at the end of this program, and it's really too bad we couldn't continue and that we have to do this on Zoom, but we hope that we are able to host you in the future here in person. And I know that I speak for everybody else when I say that we're really thankful for this talk, and I wish we could clap in person, but we will do so on Zoom. So thank you everybody for showing up, and I hope everybody has a good evening.
Thank you very much. I hope you do too. Pleasure. See you.